I'll now call the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to make some remarks in support of this legislation. It is genuinely momentous legislation. It's a change that this country has been crying out for a long time. I think all of us in the first half of this year, and particularly through the campaign, would have had a range of different experiences about where our communities were at and where our nation was at in terms of the challenges that we face and the way that the people we represent see those challenges. And I'm always mindful as a representative of the interests of younger people. I mean, we must always remember the tendency for there to be intergenerational unfairness, and climate change is one of those great examples where, as the Prime Minister said before, there's a huge risk that communities and governments and decision makers, as we are in this place, don't take our responsibility to do what's necessary and instead leave a completely unacceptable burden on young people and people essentially who will be citizens of this country in the future. For me, the standout moment in the first half of the year of the campaign was when I went to Fremantle College, which used to be South Fremantle High School when I was growing up. I went to Fremantle College to talk to high school students, years 11 and 12, I think, and I spoke to them about Australian democracy and how important it was and how they should feel their right and in their entitlement to participate in how decisions are made. And while I was explaining various things about how I represent a federal seat and the 3 levels of government and all of the other bits and pieces, there was a young woman to the left in the front of the crowd that caught my eye because she had her hand up like this. She just had her hand up. From the moment I actually was introduced to the stage, she had her hand up. And she kept her hand up, even though it was clear that I was going to be speaking for 10 minutes or something by way of introduction before we got to questions. And a teacher at some point, I think, came over to her and just said, "Hey, listen, he's going to say a few things and then there'll be time for questions." She kept her hand up. The teacher came over and she put her hand up temporarily, and the teacher went away and she put her hand up. And it was clear to me that she was in distress. And as soon as I finished speaking, which I tried to do pretty quickly, hers was the first question. And her question was, how can it be when we know the science, when we've experienced the bushfires, when we know that the last 8 years have been the hottest years on the planet on record, when Australia experienced a bushfire event that included within that event the largest bushfire in our history. We saw 3 billion animals killed, 19 million hectares torched. How can it be that you, as a representative, and all the people that you're with and the institution that you're a part of has done nothing? How can that be the case? And she was angry, she was distressed, she was insistent. It was a kind of a question and a statement mixed in together. The teachers, I think, were very supportive of her. At some point they kind of encouraged her to wrap it up. She went on for several minutes, and she was so sort of passionate and insistent and disappointed at what was going on, and that really stuck with me, because when you work in this place and you have the privilege of being part of decision making, you can start to be a bit desensitised to what it's actually like for people who are watching what we do with a great expectation for how we should respond to things that are obvious and how we should be prepared to consider things that are necessary. And so I say to that young woman, and I say to young people in Australia, that you're right to be disappointed and frustrated and distressed. And you're right, particularly over the last 10 years, to look at the way national government has conducted itself in this country with a huge amount of dismay, because it's been appalling. And young people in my part of the world, a lot of the focus in the bushfires was, of course, on the terrible inferno on the east coast, and we had similar events in Western Australia that were not as I guess, noteworthy from a media point of view because they didn't involve loss of homes and loss of lives, but did involve over 2019-20, 35% of the Stirling Range National Park burnt to the ground. We had just this most recent summer, the hottest summer on record in Western Australia. The average daily temperature was a full degree hotter than it had ever been before. In previous summers, the record of days over 40 degrees was 7. This summer recently we had 13. We had 6 days of over 40 degrees in a row. We had more days over 35 than we've ever experienced. Young people know what's happening, and they are clued in to the science in Australia and the science internationally. And they have watched what's happened in this place under the previous government with justifiable dismay, distress and rage, because what they've essentially seen is their future being utterly ignored, their well-being and the well-being of the biodiversity for which we're all responsible for in Australia being utterly ignored. And this government isn't going to allow that to stand. And this government, in passing this legislation, is doing something quite different. So I do say to young people, your feelings of anger and distress and disappointment and disbelief are all utterly justified. But look what is happening in this country now. Look what some of you, those of you who voted in the recent election, have been able to bring about in terms of change. And look what has occurred in the first few months of this government already. Unlike when the previous government went to Glasgow, where the expectation was countries would come with greater ambition, and the last government could barely be bothered to take a glossy pamphlet, didn't shift what was already an inadequate national determined contribution of 26 to 28%, one iota. One of the first acts of the Albanese Labor government was to significantly shift that dial, to commit to 43%, which Professor Mark Howden, who's the director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the ANU, and he's a vice chair of the IPCC, has said is entirely consistent with the obligations set out at Glasgow and entirely consistent with Australia's obligations and intentions to get to net zero by 2050. We know that 43% is not the end of the story. 43% is the beginning. And so are all the other changes that we're making. Restoring the Climate Change Authority so that we have proper transparency and accountability. Ensuring that there will be an annual ministerial statement of ministerial responsibility. You know, I think to those who claim that passing this legislation is unnecessary and only symbolic, miss a pretty big point. I mean, it's actually right. While there's the prerogative of the executive to go and make treaty commitments, it's actually right that we as parliamentarians, as the representatives of the people, get to have our say. And it's entirely up to everyone in this House to vote on these bills, and then it'll be the same for those in the other place. And that endorsement by the Parliament is a powerful thing in terms of certainty and clarity, but also democratic integrity. It means that the representatives of the people in Australia are endorsing that commitment and are essentially calling on the government, the responsible ministers, to deliver on those commitments. So, Deputy Speaker, this has been a long time coming, the change that we're making with this bill, and it represents a belated, important step on a path that's been neglected for a long time. It is utterly necessary for our broad health and well-being, our human health, our environmental health. It's utterly necessary in terms of our leadership as a middle power country, the 13th largest economy in the world, a nation that has among the highest per capita emissions in the world. You know, it's absolutely our responsibility to reflect those facts with our actions in our own interest and in keeping with the leadership that Australia has traditionally shown, which has been sadly lacking over the last 10 years. I look forward to these changes because they're necessary, and despite the fear-mongering that we will continue to hear, unfortunately, in this debate, this is not a balanced thing between imposts on the one hand and benefits on the other. The benefits run in both directions. There are enormous economic benefits and job benefits and pollution reduction benefits as well as climate benefits. So I support this bill wholeheartedly, and I thank the young people of Australia for their patience.